Hello, I'm Antoine, and I'd like to introduce the fourth project of the Advanced Systems Programming course. This project will be on hardware accelerators. So the focus for this project will be on the whole system and how the parts in the system interact, rather than any of the specific components in a lot of detail. Right, so how do these pieces communicate, what information gets communicated, what are the interfaces, etc. And so we'll specifically not focus on like how precise we're going to implement the hardware, different frameworks for implementing hardware accelerators, or specific application domains, right? So the focus here really is on the sort of full system big picture. Right. And in terms of requirements for actually doing this, the main thing you're going to need is a working Docker setup, and I'd strongly recommend you use some dev container setup, such as in VS Code or another IDE that supports this. It will make it a lot easier to run. Okay. So the bit of context for this, right? So all of this hardware acceleration sort of started taking off once Moore's law and Dennard scaling started slowing down. Right, so that basically meant that, well, our sequential processors were no longer getting any faster, right? And we're not really getting more processor cores at the same pace either, right? So basically means we have to do more with less at the hardware level, right? And one way to do this that we know of and that works very well is specialization, both in the hardware and the software. Right, so in hardware, we might specialize the hardware that we're running on for a specific application or class of applications, right? In the short term and the longer term, we might look at entirely new architectures, such as quantum computers or photonics or whatever, right? That can only do it really as a specific class of computation rather than the sort of general purpose compute we're used to. Similarly, on the software side, right, we can more specifically design the software for particular hardware that it's running on, rather than a sort of generic portable implementation. And more longer term, right, this might require a completely new programming model for these new architectures, etc. Okay, but the most interesting piece here is once you actually start co-designing the hardware and software, right? Where you start thinking, okay, which parts of the functionality actually need to be in a particularly efficient hardware versus what runs in software, and how should these pieces interact? And this is the focus of this project. Right, so give you an example of such a system that you probably have all heard of, and that's Google's deep learning stack. So at the hardware level, that's this TPU accelerator that you see on the right here, right? And really what this system provides is an 1 to 2 order of magnitude speed up and improvement in energy efficiency compared to just the regular CPU or GPU implementation. So how do they achieve these impressive results? Right. Well, specialization, right? So here we have a diagram of what the actual hardware of the TPU looks like, right? So in blue, you see the various memories, right? In yellow, you see the compute units, and then in green, you sort of see the interface to the outside. And if you look at these things, right, most of these look very different from what you would see in a standard processors, right? Like the memories are specialized memories for a particular purpose. You have almost no control, in sort of contrast to a regular processor where a lot of your logic would be dedicated to control, right? And then what compute you have actually takes up a significant fraction of the chip and is sort of really parallel, right, in the form of this large matrix multiply unit. The drawback of all of this, right, is that this hardware can really only do these tensor operations that it's been designed to do. This can't just run arbitrary programs. Right. So here's a big picture of what the full system looks like. Right. So the bottom right, we have the hardware. So this TPU accelerator, right, and that just plugs into the server as a PCI device, just like your GPU might have before. Right. Then we have a driver inside the operating system that sort of takes care of initializing and sort of allowing the application to actually access the hardware. And then in the application, we have this TensorFlow framework that sort of manages the access to the hardware, but can directly access the TPU, right? So you're not going through the OS for every data operation after we've sort of set up the accelerator. And that's what gets us a lot of the performance here, right? And TensorFlow, on its own sort of provides the API, right? It's sort of a high-level domain-specific abstraction for expressing these tensor computations in a way that's separated from a concrete hardware implementation, right? So you can use this to sort of implement it relatively efficiently on different hardware, but purely because it's sort of more specialized and semantic hardware abstraction, right, rather than sort of a generic programming model. Okay, so in this lab, we're going to simplify this picture a little bit, but basically we're going to look at the components on the right side here, right? So we're going to build a couple of different models of hardware accelerators that integrate into the machine through a PCI bus, right? And we're going to implement the actual driver logic, mostly focusing or sort of almost exclusively focusing on the application component here, right? So sort of this right half of the equation here, right? So we're going to implement an actual driver on a Linux system. So just something we would also do if you were building an actual hardware accelerator, say with an FPGA, right? But we're going to do this with simulation because we don't have time to actually build the full hardware. All right, and we're going to split this up into three tasks where we sort of iterate on the design to make it more and more efficient. Okay, but before we dive into the details of the individual project tasks, I'm going to give you a bit of background, right? And the main piece we need to talk about here is PCI, so the interface between the hardware and software. So what do we have available in terms of mechanisms? Right, so PCI, as I'm sure you're aware, that is an interconnect between I/O devices and the sort of processor and memory of the system, right? And there's sort of four key mechanisms that we typically worry about from the sort of driver interaction point of view. The first one is enumeration. Then we have register accesses from the CPU. We have direct memory accesses from the device to memory. And then the last one is interrupts for signaling, but actually we'll skip this one for sort of simplicity in this lab. Right. So first off, enumeration, right? So this sort of solves the key problem of, well, you turn on your computer and somehow you need to figure out what devices are there in the system, where are registers located, and stuff like that. Right. So here's an example of this. So the PCI, each PCI device provides a whole host of information to the OS and the driver that's actually using it, right? So you see information about here, for example, these device and vendor IDs that allow you to figure out what device it is, right? You see stuff like these capabilities, right, that sort of give information about features that are supported by the device, which has power management, message signal interrupts, and stuff like that. All right. Then finally, but actually most importantly, are the register locations. So you see these here. So in this case, we have two regions of memory mapped registers and one region of I/O mapped registers. We'll talk more about these in a second. But basically, this enumeration mechanism will tell the software components where to go find these registers and sort of how large these areas are. Okay, so let's talk about these registers, right? So registers basically allow the driver or the software more generally, right, to access information on the device or to sort of directly pass information to the device, right? So in the old days, we used to do this through sort of special instructions, special I/O in or out instructions, because those registers were in a sort of separate address space. But on modern systems, most of this is just handled through what is called memory mapped registers, right? So these basically to software just present as regular memory locations that just sometimes happen to behave a little differently, right? You write to a register and then the device might actually do something in response to that write. But in terms of how you access this, you just use your regular memory read and write instructions, right? And through PCI, right, these actually get exposed by the device through these base address registers or bars, right? That basically specify the regions of memory where the device has registers available. But how those registers are then sort of divided up or laid out over the memory region, right? That's up to the specific device, right? And then, like, one other difference here, right, is for this memory, as I said, right, it doesn't necessarily have to behave as actual memory. So it might be the case that like you write to a register and the next time you read it, you're just going to read back 0, or some locations might not be writable, which basically means if you write to them, nothing will happen, right? And it will just keep the old value. Some registers might actually change when you read them. So the act of reading a register could affect the device as well, right? So there's sort of small differences in how they behave, right? So you do need to be aware that you're sort of interacting with registers, right? But sort of the key bit here is that registers are a sort of unidirectional mechanism where the CPU here accesses information on the device and gets the result back. And while that is happening, that particular core is basically blocked, right? So you do a read and then you have to wait for this response to come back before you can proceed executing, right? So if you're doing something like writing some, transferring some data from the device into memory, right? You sort of have this pattern here, right? Where you go read like a word or 64 bits, maybe slightly larger with vector instructions, but a sort of small unit. You write it to memory, and then you go again, right? And in each of those phases here, you're actually spending a decent amount of time just waiting. So this is not a particularly efficient mechanism for transferring large quantities of data because you end up wasting a lot of CPU time. And that's where direct memory access comes in. So the sort of the very bird's eye view of this is that this is just the whole thing done in reverse, right? So previously we had the CPU accessing memory on the device, or registers on the device, right? And DMA is basically the flip side, which is basically the device accessing memory on the host. So the device can at any point basically issue a read or a write to memory that completely bypasses the CPU. Right, so that allows the device to asynchronously and independently access data without the CPU having to be involved on the critical path, right? For doing this, one important key bit here, right, is that the device actually is accessing this memory by physical address rather than the sort of virtual address, because this completely bypasses the actual address translation in the regular core. Newer systems, you might have some address translation through a separate IOMMU, but we'll ignore this in this course for simplicity, right? So in general, you're just directly accessing physical memory, right? But how you actually do this, like how the device does this, again, is sort of up to the device and sort of the contract between the driver and the hardware. Right? So typically, well, the driver first has to tell the device, at least at some point, maybe only during initialization, but you have to tell the device what memory to go read and write, like where your buffers are and stuff like that. And so typically the way you would do this is sort of this pattern here on the right? So you sort of have the CPU that writes to a register that tells the device, oh, this is the physical address where your buffer is at. And then at some point later, the device can go in and fetch this, completely bypassing the CPU, right? So the CPU can do other stuff while this is going on. And so this is sort of fully asynchronous and parallel, right? But it's again unidirectional, sort of in the opposite way, where the device can directly access memory without the CPU being involved at all. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to use these mechanisms in the tasks in the lab. So as a first step, we're just going to basically design a very simple interface for our accelerator. And for all of these three steps, what we're going to use is a simple matrix multiplication accelerator. All right, so matrix multiplication is sort of a simplistic task, but the sort of core computation is not the focus here. Right? We're going to focus on the interaction between the hardware component and the software. All right, so in the first step, we're going to design the interface. Very simple set of registers, basically, right, through programmed I/O registers. In the second step, we're going to actually implement the hardware component as a sort of simple simulation model. So we're not actually going to write Verilog, etc. We're just going to write this as a C program, right? But we're going to implement the same behavior that the hardware would have. Right? And then once we have sort of the hardware available, we're then going to implement the driver. And we're going to do this through this Linux BFIO PCI interface, which is basically an interface that allows applications to directly access PCI devices without going through the kernel or without having a specialized kernel driver. So that just makes development a little easier, right? And sort of for how this interface works, right? We sort of we're going to have a set of control registers, right, where you can sort of tell the device what to do, some status registers, etc. Sort of one of the key bits, right, that you typically have with most devices is that when hardware is doing things, they often sort of from the CPU's point of view will take a long time, right? So you tell the device to do something, and they will go off and do it, and eventually it'll be done. So the way we typically realize this with a programmed I/O register interface is that you sort of have control registers, right, where you tell the device, okay, now go do this. And then later you come back and you go check a status register on the device, or you can check, is it done yet? Once it's done, right, you can then go to the device and sort of pull out your outputs. Right, in between you sort of store all the data on the device so the device can complete its operation. So you put inputs in, tell the device, okay, now get started. Once the device tells you it's done, you take the outputs back out. Right? So here's a very simplified example of a register interface, which is actually for the serial port, a sort of old school device, but still very heavily used in the embedded systems world, and also whenever you're doing any sort of OS debugging or development, you might be familiar with this, right? So basically here what we have is a serial port where we just write out bytes individually, and we can receive bytes in the opposite direction, right? So for both of those, we have two registers. Here we have this status register, line status register. So if you want to write an entry or write a byte to the serial port, we first have to check, okay, is there actually space in the hardware buffer on the port, right? Because that's transmitting stuff sort of asynchronously and actually pretty slowly usually, right? So there's some back pressure involved. So first you have to check, is there space? If no, then you have to wait, right? So you just keep reading this register until it tells you, okay, now there's space, right? And then we write the actual data, so this byte that we want to write into this transmit hold register, and after that we're sort of done. Now the device has the data and it will eventually go send it out. So for the flip side, if you want to receive a byte on the serial port, right, you do the same thing. You read the status register that will tell you whether there's some data ready through like one of those bits in the register, right? Once that bit is set to 1, you know, okay, now there's a byte available, and you can then go read the byte from this, I guess, receive buffer register here. And so it's a very simple interface. The one for the matrix multiplication is going to be slightly more complicated, but not much more. Okay, then in the second step, we're going to make this a bit more efficient, right? Because as you might imagine, this sounds relatively expensive from the CPU's point of view. If you're sort of copying in your complete matrices through registers into the device, right? So we're going to use DMA to make this faster, right? But actually, it's going to turn out that first we can redesign our very simple interface a little bit, actually, to avoid some of the communication. So instead of trying to make it more efficient through DMA, we'll find some opportunities to just cut out some unnecessary redundant transfers that happen repeatedly. And then once we've done that, in the second step, we're actually going to use DMA to do the sort of remaining communication more efficiently. And this is really sort of a more general part of how you approach optimizing this communication, right? You first figure out, okay, what communication actually needs to happen, right? And then you figure out, okay, the communication that doesn't need to happen, how do I do that more efficiently? Right, and sort of the key bit here is just going to be that, well, actually copying all this data is expensive, right? Especially with these sort of larger matrices, right? So basically having DMA to allow the accelerator to directly read inputs from memory and write outputs back to memory takes that load off the CPU, right? And sort of also allows the CPU to potentially do other things. Okay, and then in the third step, or the third project in this task, we're gonna make things even more efficient, right? So in the first and second step, where the accelerator is always going to be doing one operation at a time. Okay, so you put in your inputs, or you at least tell the accelerator where the inputs are. You write to a control register to tell it to start operating, and then eventually it'll tell you that it's done, and then you can sort of rinse and repeat and like do the next operation, right? This again is not particularly efficient once your hardware is relatively fast, right? So it's actually going to turn out that like the hardware accelerator is going to be able to actually do the compute quite a bit quicker than the CPU can feed in data, at least through this slow interface. Right? And this is actually the same thing that you're going to see with any modern I/O device, modern network card, a modern disk. It's actually, as these devices have gotten faster, the communication between the software and the hardware is increasingly the bottleneck. Right? And so one way to optimize this is through asynchronous queues in this hardware-software interface. Right? So the idea is basically we want to be able to queue up work for the device asynchronously and have the device work sort of in parallel, just churning on its compute and completing operations, while the CPU is busy adding more work. Right, so we can sort of hand off a batch of operations, right, and then the accelerator will complete them and sort of complete them asynchronously. The way we do this, as I said, is through this queue abstraction here, right? So conceptually, this looks relatively simple. So we have this queue that resides in memory. So adding stuff to this queue is mostly just some memory writes in the driver, right? The accelerator then accesses this queue. Again, can access it because it's memory, can access it through DMA, right? But the driver is sort of stuffing in elements on one end, and the accelerator is dequeuing them on the other side. Right, so this is what's going to enable the two pieces to operate in parallel. Right, in parallel, but also sort of asynchronously in the sense that they don't necessarily have to add stuff at the same pace or sort of right at the right time. Right, so you can enqueue a bunch of stuff, and then the accelerator will have some time to go finish the compute. Okay. On the driver side, right, so the way this works, as I said, is that the queue is in memory. So the driver first actually has to allocate this memory, then tells the device where it is in physical memory, right? You have to tell the device where that queue is, how long it is, etc., through registers, right? And then the driver adds some data to the queue, right? Now, one of the tricky bits is how does the accelerator know when there's data in the queue, right? And so technically, the device could just poll, right? It could just use DMA to just read it repeatedly. That turns out to be very inefficient over the PCI bus and relatively expensive, just because of the sort of larger distance involved. So optimized designs will not do this. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use one register here for the driver to signal the device basically how many entries have been added to the queues. So this is typically called the tail index register because it sort of refers to the tail of the queue. So the driver will add an entry or add a couple of entries, right? And then it will increment that tail index register to indicate the new position of sort of the last added entries, right? And then the accelerator now knows, okay, this is how many entries are in the queue, and it can then asynchronously go fetch them, right, as it completes them. Right, but now it doesn't have to poll. It's sort of the driver will tell it, okay, this is how many, and then asynchronously will go do the bulk of the work and fetch them. And typically, we sort of have the opposite side to figure out when operations complete, where you again would sort of use this thing flipped in reverse, right? You would again have a queue, typically a completion queue, where the device would then, completion or notification queue, where the device would tell the driver which operations have completed. Right. Okay. And then on the hardware side, right, the hardware, as it sort of starts up, as it initializes, will do nothing, right? Until the driver sort of finally tells it, like accesses those registers, initializes the queue registers, tells the hardware about the length of the queue, etc. And until the driver actually tells the hardware that some entries were added by a write to this tail index register, the hardware is sort of passive, right? Only once it actually gets the notification, okay, some entries have been added, will it start processing, right? But basically the driver does all the sort of complicated work of allocating memory, figuring out where this stuff is, initializing these positions in the registers, and the accelerator then just takes this and then operates on that data structure. Right, there is one optimization here, which is that since this queue is typically implemented as a sort of circular buffer in memory, circular buffer of slots or descriptors, depending on the device, right? And these are actually contiguous in memory, right? So instead of just fetching these entries one by one, because often they might not be that large, you can actually fetch multiple of these entries in one operation. So you do batching basically, right? So you do a DMA read, it's going to read 4 of those at the same time, for example, right? Which is going to amortize some of the overheads for doing these small operations. Okay, but that's basically how these queues work, right? So in the third step, you're going to implement this for this matrix multiplication accelerator. Okay. And then finally, there's one complication, right? Which is, well, how are we going to evaluate this? As I said, we don't actually want to do a full hardware design because that takes relatively long, and there's also a lot of negotiating with the tools to see, does it meet timing, various bugs, etc. It just takes a lot longer. It's more painful to actually build this, even if it's with FPGAs, right? Like it takes a fair amount of time. And it's not actually the focus here, right? Because depending on what you're going to do, if you're going to work on hardware acceleration, you really have to study the concrete tool chains you're going to use. You're going to work in a particular FPGA subsystem. You're going to work on AMD FPGAs, but you have to know the tools, you have to know the interfaces, etc. That's beyond the scope of this. We want to just focus on sort of the core aspects of what these components are, how they interact. So this is generic across different implementations. Whether you do this with AMD FPGAs, Intel FPGAs, or whether you go out and actually build a chip, right? This is, we're focusing on the universal parts here. So the way we're going to evaluate this here and run it and test it is in simulation, right? So we're going to use a full system simulation framework where we can run the complete system, where we're going to run a Linux machine basically with a real application in there that uses this Linux VFIO PCI interface to sort of implement the driver, right? And then we're gonna simulate the hardware, and we're gonna use the Simbrix full system simulation framework, which is a sort of research project that has come out of my group. To basically do this, right? So in this case, actually what this is going to look like is we're going to use the Gem5 simulator to sort of simulate most of the machine, right? And then we're going to have a separate simulator that simulates our hardware. They're going to interact through this PCI protocol here. Actually, if you really are interested, you can have a closer look at Simbrix on the website. This is all open source, and you can actually use the project here to assemble much more complicated systems, right? So you could set up multiple machines, each with accelerators, connected over networks, etc. You can do all of that, but that's if you're curious, right? You're not gonna have to mess with these configurations if you just want to run the basic project here. Okay, and that's it for this introduction. There's a couple of pointers here in case you're interested. The first couple ones here are on actual production hardware accelerators, right? The first one from Google. The second one, this VTA, is an open source hardware implementation, including the sort of full hardware and software stack. Some background on PCI, on this VFIO infrastructure that we use for the driver here, and on the simulation. But you can find these links in on the course website. Okay? And with that, I hope you have fun doing these projects. And please do reach out if you have any questions or problems. Thanks.